So first and foremost, I think a good topic to talk about is the prayer beads. And then from there we'll open the floor. Because I'm sure that before indulging into the topic of the prayer beads, I'd like to ask you, how has your experiences been on this topic?
Using prayer beads?
Using prayer beads, yeah. Or where have you traveled? What have you heard? What have you read?
What I know of the more stricter groups is that they're not on Turkish stance. They're bid'ah, the highest order, and they have the saying of a Sahaba where they say there's a man who's counting his tasbih with rocks.
Could you put this come closer?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe we can. Yeah, a little bit closer here. So you were saying about
They have the hadith, or not hadith, I guess it's that, where the guy is counting with rocks. And one Sahabi says to the other, I saw something that I didn't see in the Prophet's time. They use that as the idea that it's a great bid'ah. Nobody should do it. I know that there's some people in Egypt that, depending on the masjid you go to, you might get run out of the masjid. I know the masjid here, they're not very fond of it. My understanding is that it's okay to do it. A lot of people
In Pakistan, it's very common. People use it.
In Pakistan?
Yeah, Pakistan, India, South Asia. In fact, I have been using it a lot.
So when you use it, how do you use it? What's your purpose behind it?
Zikr.
Okay.
It's just make it convenient, and it's kind of like a reminder when you have the counter. So that there are nice fancy counters these days. So when you have the counter, it just looks nice, and then for people it looks nice, and people get curious and they ask questions. But again, it's a reminder for you to make zikr on it, and it makes zikr easy for you, and you are mindful.
Very good.
If you have something in your pocket or in your hand, and it is for some purpose, right?
Yeah.
So why use it? But there is at the same time when you use it, so the thought that people what they might say.
Very good. So as you can see, subhanallah, actually the topic of the prayer beads, they call it, right? It's actually a very old topic. It's not a new topic. So we're saying that the Prophet ﷺ was revealed to, right, over 1,500 years ago. And at the age of approximately 63, he passes away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the companions take over, etc. So the question of this topic in of itself has actually been fairly old. And you find scholars discussing the topic from the past in great depth. But long story short, what happens is, as you propose and as you've seen, some think it disliked, right? It's disliked. In their opinion, as you said, it's because it wasn't something that was practiced at the early period, and they hold certain references. And then the others say, no, it's fine if your intention is good. So I just want us to think of something. I don't know if you've heard of Imam al-Shawkani, rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam al-Shawkani, he's a scholar, actually fairly late in comparison to others. So, 1800s. And he is well-read and a great faqih, and he writes many books. And one of the books that he writes is called Nail al-Awtar. Nail al-Awtar is a book about fiqh. So on topics, he comes and he goes into depth of various opinions and their reasonings, and he provides adillah. So a person who, just as a side point, who's interested on a topic to know the varying opinions that are old and that are out there, it's a good book to get a chance to read. Once you've had certain tools to move on to that, like the third level, let's say advanced fiqh, go into those type of books. But anyways, he has a topic about doing tasbih. Okay, and in this topic of tasbih, there's a subsection about the masbah. So what happens is he goes into depth, and in his opinion he shows the adillah that it's not in any way an innovation, and it is a practice that has been practiced, and actually he puts in references as adillah from the companions' times. So Abu Hurairah, for example, is attributed to him that he used to do tasbih with a type of pebbles, for example, among others from the companions and the tabi'een. And Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi in his Sirah A'lam al-Nubala, on the top of Abu Hurairah in his section, he actually mentions that narration as well. He specifies it. Abu Hurairah, for example, he used to do tasbih with types of pebbles. So what happens is, other than that, there are other companions as well. And there is a narration that had happened at the time of Prophet ﷺ that there is some debate about its authenticity. Prophet ﷺ comes into his wife's presence, and she's doing tasbih, and she's doing it with pebbles. Now when we say with pebbles, what does that mean? She's using it to count, right? And the Prophet ﷺ enters upon her and he doesn't negate the practice. So this is a narration, it's in the Sunan, there's some debate about its authenticity. Whatever the case, so as a result you find fuqaha and their varying opinions throughout history. And what's interesting is, what's a name out there that you would say in the minds of many people, or is considered in the minds of many people, very strict? And he's a resource for a type of mindsets that his saying basically is the final say among others. Who would you say?
Ibn Taymiyyah.
Ibn Taymiyyah, yeah. Taqiyuddin Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. So Taqiyuddin Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala, if you look through his Majmu' al-Fatawa, and inshallah we'll talk about that, you'll find that in a lot of questions he always says, Imam Shafi'i says this, Imam Abu Hanifa says this, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal says this, Imam Malik, rahimahullah, he says this. So he always goes back to the A'imma. In many, arguably maybe 95% of his masail, actually almost every single question. And if he himself holds a different point of view, he may say reasoning for that, and this is who said it before me, etc., these type of things. So for example, one of the topics that he had discussed in detail is some of that in Ramadan, and a person asks him a question. Do a person, for example, without getting into too many details to confuse some individuals, his response is Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa and Ahmad ibn Hanbal say this, Imam Shafi'i says this, and he ends his response. So this is something very important. So as you can see, Ibn Taymiyyah himself, who's a faqih of the Hanbali madhab, he grew up in that mentality. He is still an individual who goes back to the opinions of the A'imma in many masail. There are certain questions in which some argue that he differed with the four A'imma in, because he did ijtihad in that mas'ala. And that's a different topic. But we go back to the topic of the masbah, the prayer beads. So he has a section about dhikr. Okay? And in that section, he talks about this mas'ala, prayer beads. So he says, Prophet ﷺ, he talks about a narration where Prophet ﷺ talks about using the fingers. فإنهم مسؤولات. استنصرت يوم القيامة أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. So he's saying it's sunnah to use the fingers. And it is also good, he or she who uses pebbles, for example, for counting and these things, that's also good. Ibn Taymiyyah is saying that, Hasanun. Because Abu Hurairah did that, and Prophet ﷺ passed Salama, and he didn't denounce her for doing that practice, among other things as well. But then he moves on to a third section, in which it is talking about beads that are basically tied. They're tied up. This section here. So he made it into three sections. Tasbih with the fingers, sunnah. Practice of the pebbles and, or you can say date stones for counting. He said, فَحَسَنًا, it's good. It's good. You have practice Abu Hurairah on these things. Then he moved on to something with a string-like substance that has beads. And he says, this practice, if the intention is good, فَحَسَنًا. That's what he said. If their intention is good when using the prayer beads, فَحَسَنًا, it's good. Then he moves on after that. وَلَكِنْ إِذَا لَا يُوجَدْ and he goes on to explain that if there isn't a major need for it, and the reasoning why it is disliked for some people. Because before he said that it is good, if a person has good intention, he said some people dislike it, some people like it. Then he explained. He said if it is out of a good intention, it's good. But then he goes on to explain what is meant by not so good, of having an illicit intention. I think you can imagine why. You talked about that, right?
Yeah.
So he said that some people, they wear it on their hands, right? They put it into like a bracelet, or they wear it like a necklace, in a certain fashion. Or, for example, they, essentially this is the main thing, is that they are basically showing off. Some people, they show off with it. You see, some people, they show off. And that was the main reason why he said it was in the category of those that thought it disliked, is because people, they show off with it. So because of the thing, one of the reasons. So because of that, it goes with intention. And that's a very important thing. So he said, if a person has good intention, فَحَسَنٌ. So as you said, people use the prayer beads, they know that in of itself it doesn't change the weather, right? In of itself it doesn't cause the moon to eclipse, none of these things, right? But they use it counts, right, for counting, in their tasbih, for their prayers, and also for a reminder for some people, among other things as well. So as you can see, this is a fairly old question, a fairly old discussion, but with knowledge, inshallah, people become more relaxed, as we talked about. And unfortunately, we are living in a time period in which there's a lot of information, but there's not a lot of comprehension. So as a result, there are some relative positions, and people are slightly get confused by it. I remember there was a person who was making tasbih. He came to the masjid, okay, and or a different place, and he was making tasbih and using the masbaha, and a person comes to him and he said, that's an innovation, you should stop doing that. So one of the criteria of doing amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi anil munkar is that you, among other things, other than being kind, you see, other than being wise, أن تكون عليما فيما تؤمر وأن تكون عليما فيما تنهى. You have to be knowledgeable about what you're talking about, essentially.
Yeah.
You have to be knowledgeable about the topic you are discussing. So imagine this. We talked about this individual who, the reason why it's important just to, at times, to quote Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah, especially, is because for certain people, he's the greatest marja'. And for them, if he's not saying something or you hold a position, they don't necessarily feel very relaxed until he makes a statement about the topic. So Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, which is enjoining good and forbidding evil. And right now, that topic is a topic in which people under that guise have caused a lot of harm, under the guise of enjoining good and forbidding evil. And they use a narration which is إذا رأيت منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه الحديث المشهور كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم, right? So they say the narration is you got to change it with your hands. That's the highest level of iman. If you can't change it with your hands, then it's going to be with your tongue. If you can't, that with your heart. ذلك ضعف الإيمان. So this is the narration they use. But unfortunately, a lot of them, when it comes to enjoining good and forbidding evil, they didn't study the topic systematically. So actually, it is a topic that's systematically discussed among fuqaha from early periods, among jurists in early periods. So Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala is discussing the topic. And as a side point, when he is talking about إذا رأيت منكرا فليغيره بيده الحديث المشهور, right? When he's describing this narration, he goes into linguistics among other things, and he says to change al-munkar first comes with the heart, then with the tongue, and the last thing is with the hand. So people are confused about this narration, and it's not ala zahirihi. It's not as it seems apparent to some people's minds, because there's a pronominal and also linguistic construction and meaning that is involved. And he explains as well that the madhab of the Quran is that you change with the heart first and the tongue, and then the topic of hand gets involved. However, he also explains that the idea of changing, if you cause more harm in it than good, then you shouldn't change that thing. Some people, they think because I have to change it because of this wrong that's in it, they don't realize the way you're changing it could cause even more harm. And what you've changed in that thing could bring about more harm. So the idea behind that is a very important thing to consider in Amr bil Ma'ruf. This is Ibn Taymiyyah talking about this, rahimahullah ta'ala, Taqiyuddin. So he goes on to explaining the foundations of doing Amr bil Ma'ruf and Munkar, and joining good and forbidding evil, Majmu' al-Fatawa. And he describes that a person, the methodology of it correlates to the tradition. that you be knowledgeable about what you are enjoining and knowledgeable about what you are denouncing. So Malik ibn Anas, for him, for example, to respond to a question, you have to know the varying opinions in that topic. You see? You have to have studied those opinions in this particular topic to be able to respond and or discuss it in a fashion in which you are representing a legitimate source. So Taqiyuddin talks about this, and he also mentions that if you're going to do enjoying good and forbidding evil, you're going to have knowledge about the topic. You have to have knowledge about the topic. And as a side point, when there are topics that there are legitimate varying opinions, you're not doing forbidding evil in that topic. So there could be a topic or a subject, and there are legitimate differences of opinion on the subject. You know, if you think in your mind you're doing forbidding evil, tanha anil munkar, it's not necessarily the case in that case. So that's why you find a lot of Jews, when they talk about questions of legitimate varying opinions, and if they are not bringing about opinions in which it causes major destruction to people, then that topic, you leave it. You leave that particular aspect. It's a very deep thing, and for those that are interested, Taqiyuddin Ahmed Taymiyyah, he has a risala, he has writings to the Qada, judges, and he talks about this topic of differences of opinion, among other things. And amongst those topics, he talks about Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, and he says that he's a scholar, and it's important that people defend the respects of the scholar, and the concept of takfir of Al-Ghazali, for example, is completely denounced. So this is Ibn Taymiyyah talking about Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, among others. But going to the topic of varying opinions, he goes into depth and very interesting details. And he talks about how in various scenarios there could be a subject in which a person holds a view and another person holds a view, and they're legitimate comprehensions. At that point, you cannot denounce the other. You leave that person and you go on your own way. And it's not okay to denounce him, to ostracize him, to degrade that person, among other things. So that's Taqiyuddin Ahmed Taymiyyah is talking like that. Imagine. So it's very important. Among other things, there's very interesting topics and statements. You'd be surprised that contradicts many individuals out there that claim they love him very much. You know, they claim they love him very much. So we were talking about Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. So being knowledgeable about what you are calling for in good, enjoining good, and being knowledgeable about that which you are denouncing. And what is the fruits of this subject? You know, if you're going to tell him to do good, what type of benefit will bring about in that? And if you're going to denounce this person, what type of negativities will come about in that? So it's a very deep topic, and he actually goes into great depth about it. He goes on to explain you have to be, rafiqin. You be a person of friendship, of friendliness in doing so. And takuna haliman. Halim is to be patient, forbearing, because of the difficulties that may come about, among other things as well. But these points of being knowledgeable about what you're talking about and denouncing, and the concept of being takuna rafiqan, friendly, merciful, kind, etc., unfortunately it's missing out in a lot of people's minds. And especially those that think, again, under the guise, Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. Under this guise, a lot of things, a lot of negativities has come about. A lot of negativities has come about in that aspect. So this is an important topic. So in the masjid, you find at times people, they use the masbaha. Right? They're using it for tasbih. Or, for example, I was in a gathering one day and a person was talking about tasbih, and the topic of masbah came about. And what they were trying to illustrate is a pious scenario, a young person who's doing tasbih, and he's counting, and he's remembering God. And another person came in and he said, that's an innovation. He said, that's a bid'ah. The masbah is a bid'ah. So as you can see, when you go back to this topic, Taqiyuddin Ahmed Taymiyyah talks about if the intention is good, then it's good. He talks about Abu Hurairah and Salama, how they used pebbles for counting, among other things. But if a person starts to use it to show off in these things, it's a different case. So a person should again be aware of who he is and how their intention is, and consider things in that aspect. Take it into consideration. Allah Allah.
Yeah. So, related question, it's not related in fact. The use of spoon for eating food.
Yeah.
Personally I have been using spoon for eating rice, since I was a child.
Yeah.
And for me, I can't eat rice with fingers.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, but when I eat and sit with, mashallah, pious people, so they'll be like, that's bid'ah, why are you doing that?
They said it's a bid'ah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's not a bid'ah.
Interesting question.
So the word bid'ah, it's important to understand what the word means and how jurists in the past they talked about what a bid'ah. So traditionally, in linguistically, essentially what it's talking about is something of a new generated element. So there could be a lot of new generated things that's very beneficial. Cars, if you use it in a good fashion, various formalities in agriculture, among other things as well. When it came into religious aspects and a foundational level, bid'ah entailed someone doing something contradictory to what is called for. So Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, he has a risala. Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi is a colleague and friend of Ibn Taymiyyah. He has a risala about the bid'ah. So in this risala, in this letter, he talks about the essential foundation of the meaning of bid'ah. And he explains that the essential foundation of the meaning of bid'ah, if someone is doing something that contradicts, it is contrary to what Islam is calling for. So that definition, other than going to Imam al-Shatibi's work about bid'ah and these type of things, that definition is a very good definition to take into consideration when a person is studying the topic as a foundation, as a istilah, something that contrary to what Islam teaches. Right? What Islam teaches. So basically, in this general formality of it, there are going to be some subcategories in the topic. When it comes into religion, same idea, something that is contrary to what Islam teaches. A person doesn't want to get married out of piety, assuming that marriage degrades piety. This is considered a bid'ah. So if a person says, I'm not going to sleep, I'm just going to pray all night, that is considered something, meaning out of piety, that there's no such thing as sleep, for example. That is considered in that category. A person who says, for example, this and that, and these things. So you find that the Prophet ﷺ talked about this. These young men don't want to get married out of thinking that's piety. A person says, I'm not going to sleep, basically ever in my mind, and these type of things. And he says, the Prophet ﷺ says, I get married, and I sleep, and I pray, and I break my fast, and I fast. Then he explains, he who doesn't follow my methodology is not from that methodology, not from that element in which I am teaching. لَيْسَ مِنِّي. So this is a very good foundation to take into consideration. Now the topic of spoon, a person using a spoon other than the fingers, it may be considered a form of a bid'ah in a linguistic sense. Mm-hmm. For example, it wasn't as common, the concept of spoons in the early periods among the Arabs, right? When they ate the fingers, and many other regions as well. Something solely that was adopted. It was shared by customary cultural practices. So in this regard, in a linguistic sense, it's a possibility a person may say that. However, to say that it is an innovation in the sense, kulli bid'atun dalala, that in that aspect, that's not correct. That's not correct.
Is there any bid'ah hasana?
So the topic of a bid'ah hasana, again, is a topic in which there is several analysis on the topic. So bid'ah hasana, for those that talk about this topic in the sense that it is something legitimate, in their perspective, it means that something that supports the goals of what is teaching by the Islamic teachings. So it's not contrary, it doesn't contradict the Islamic teachings. So Uthman ibn Affan, rahimahullah ta'ala, his action in which he called for the Mus'haf, the Quran, to be copied from the original Quran, Abu Bakr compiled among other things as well. And in that practice, 7 copies or so, and he sent them out. So that was a practice in which he was supporting something of good, and it wasn't contradictory to that which was established Islamic teachings. Based upon that, when you look to the Quran, it went through stages. So stages in the sense of support of how to understand and read the Quran, its preservation. And one of those stages is to put the symbols in, because originally there were no symbols, in the sense what we have nowadays, complete symbols. Fatha, Kasra, Dhamma, and all of these things. It was something that was placed in over time. So in the concept of the bid'ah hasana, in this example, as you can see, it is supportive. It is supportive of the goals that are teachings. It helps people read, especially those that don't have the formalities, for example, the Arabic language, mansub, majroor, these type of grammatical references. So it helped the person when he read the Quran. And as you can see, actually, it's very important because it helps a lot of people. Even, for example, Arab speakers, for example, even nowadays, many of them, they need that. They need the fatha, they need the dhamma, they need the kasra, they need the quf and sul and these things. It helps them. And then in the later period, you have the colored type of Quranic texts. It helps with tajweed, ghunna and ikhfa and these things. So it is supportive. So a person in this idea would say it's a bid'ah hasana. And in this concept, what it does is supporting that which is good, and it is not contradictory to what is established. So the concept of bid'ah hasana, again, particularly in the madhab al-shafi'iyya, is something that is held fast to quite a bit. And among others from the later periods, from the Malikiyya and the Ahnaf as well, among others as well. So in this idea, under this concept of bid'ah hasana, there are subcategories, and under this concept, there are certain subcategories in which there are varying opinions if it's okay or not. Right? There are varying opinions if that particular thing is okay or not. So this is a general sense. Right? In a general sense, a slight description on the topic of bid'ah hasana. And see. So Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, for example, Fath al-Bari, he talks about this. He says there is bid'ah hasan, there is bid'ah sayyi'ah, these things, differentiating between the two. Now, this is a general formality just to give us a better understanding. You go into some subcategories, the topic of the mawlid, does it fall under the bid'ah hasana or is it the sayyi'ah and these things? So you have those varying opinions about it because it's a subcategory under the concept of bid'ah hasana.
Mawlid, as in the birthday?
Yeah, celebrating. Yeah, celebrating.
What is your opinion on it?
I prefer not to respond my humble opinion, but a response is that there are two views, essentially. One view is that it's okay to take into consideration the concept that Prophet ﷺ was a person who brought goodness and happened to be happy about that. And that, for example, there's a narration that talks about fasting Monday. Prophet ﷺ talks about that was the day of the week I was born, among other things as well. So in that concept, showing appreciation for this bounty and being happy about it is a very beautiful thing. The second opinion is that it's okay to especially emphasize this day without going overboard, without going into an extreme. And some Jews from the later period, they held this view. In a historical sense, there was a king by the name of Muzaffar, and it is argued that he was the first one who really systematically established the Mawlid. And that was approximately, from what I can tell, about the 5th century. But when he did that, you see, he was a very pious man. So if you open up Sirah A'lam al-Nubala, Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi talks about this individual. A very pious individual, he loves Sunnah Salihin and these things. The concept of the Mawlid for him was a concept of a reminder to the people of the appreciation. So during his time, there were many scholars. So when he considered establishing it as a systematic approach through a governmental observation, the fuqaha around him, they didn't stop him. And they didn't say, no, that's a bad thing and these type of things. So in their perspective, it was considered bid'ah hasana, because they held that view that it is okay in this circumstance, because of the circumstances of the people, and they needed to remember, it's a time to remember Prophet ﷺ and to be appreciative of the revelation, what he represents, and these type of things. What the two opinions agree on is people that may go into extreme in this time. And I think you can consider why that is something that they both agree on. But Imam al-Suyuti, for example, he talked about the Mawlid and he appreciates it, among other scholars from the Malikiyya and the Hanafiyya, etc. I hope to have addressed the question. So I think it's one of those topics you shouldn't be overly aggressive about.
Yeah.
And a particular day in which he was born is something actually debated, historically. Like Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, he talks about the number of opinions about that are out there correlating to the day in which he was actually born. So there are many differences of opinion among other things as well. But nowadays you'll go to various countries and they have it. And they appreciate it and they take it as a governmental celebration, country celebration. Egypt, and you find in other places as well. Imarat, especially UAE, among others as well. So the wise person will be a person who knows that there is that opinion out there, and the two opinions agree not to go into great extremes, and they both agree on other aspects of showing appreciation of Prophet ﷺ and remembering him. It's just specifying this particular extra happiness, for example. It's something where they have various point of views. But those that held the view, again, that it is okay, they have references they refer back to, and a number of scholars as well, jurists as well, that support that opinion as well. So I don't think people should be very angry about this topic. I don't think they should be overly aggressive about the topic as well. Allahu A'lam. I hope to have addressed the question. Yeah.
So Solar asked a really good question earlier with regards to Ramadan. So travel for leisure, just for fun. Does that count as not taking that day off of fasting?
Yeah.
Should you fast that day, not fast that day?
Yeah, so that's a travel for leisure, and is it okay to break your fast that day or not?
For example, the scenario is that I'm traveling to Medford,
Yeah.
right? So, like, I started my journey now, right, with a few of my friends to Medford.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I'm traveling.
Yeah.
I can break my fast.
Yeah.
And does it, I don't know.
Yeah.
What I mean.
So, travel for work, you see travel for something that's a topic, particular topic, generally speaking, is okay to break your fast and shorten your prayers and these type of things. The topic of traveling just for leisure in of itself is a slight, there is an analysis on it, but inshallah it's fine as well. If it falls under the umbrella of travel, then a person can go ahead and break their fast, and they can shorten their prayers, they can combine their prayers, they can fast later, inshallah. And that's what Taqiyuddin Ahmed Taymiyyah, he also hold the view, because it's a general meaning of what is entailed by travel, whatever the intention is. Some scholars, they debated if it is intention out of ma'asi, if a person has the intent of doing sin.
So it actually depends on the type of person and the type of and the intention that he or she has when traveling in Ramadan.
So what I'm trying to say is that some scholars, for example, there's an opinion of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal that if a person travels and their intent is sin in their travel, there is some debate about if it's okay, for example, to shorten your prayers and these type of things. Yeah. But generally speaking, just to shorten, make it easy, like Taqiyuddin, he says, if it's travel, it's travel. And even if it's travel for leisure, you can break your fast. If it's travel for work, of course you can break your fast, inshallah. And or if you're sick, among other things as well, shortening your prayers as well. The topic also comes up, if you actually make the intention to travel, is it okay to break your fast while you're resident in the residence, or do you have to leave the boundaries of the city? So there are opinions in the topic, but for example, Anas bin Malik, he held the view that you can break your fast in the city, even before physically leaving. So he broke his fast while in the city. He had the intention, a certain intention that indeed he will travel, and he broke his fast in the city before traveling, among others as well. Some others say, you have to get out of the city, then you can break it. But that's a discussion, It's a discussion they have among the scholars.
So, related this question, so I saw a few of friends, they were traveling to, for example, Medford, I would say, and then they posted on Facebook that, so ABC are eating lunch at this restaurant, right? So they're my good friends, and I happened to post a comment on their post, and I commented that usually these things are not posted on Facebook in public. And this guy actually deleted the post.
Yeah.
So when I saw the post, an hour ago, so I was debating in my mind, what should I do now? Should I just text him, just delete this post, but then I was because he posted it in public, and so I commented.
Yeah, sure, I understand.
So I don't know if I did the right thing or not.
Yeah. So let me put a scenario out there for us to think about. You see a person drinking water in Ramadan. He's done it out of forgetfulness. They're drinking. Should you tell him to stop drinking, or should you leave him?
No, you should not tell.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, wait till he's done.
Wait till he's done? Yeah. So what's going to happen actually if you go to Islam QA, for example, and you put in the question, the response is that you should tell him.
You should?
In their point of view, that they, الترجيح عندهم, they say you should tell him.
While he's drinking?
Yeah, be like, hey, you're fasting.
Cause a mess.
So, there is that opinion out there. But there's also the opinion that no, you don't stop him. And then afterwards you can remind each other or something like that. And there's some observations for the reasoning, because in Allah, at'amahu Allah wa saqa, God is the one who gave him that food, and that God is the one who gave him that drink to drink. I remember there was a question that came up, and it was at a school in San Jose. I was there for some time. And at this school, what happened was there was a drinking fountain, it's Ramadan, and they put a sign, remember you're fasting, underneath it, remember you're fasting. So the discussion came up, is that a good idea or is it not a good idea? And if a person is drinking, should you remind them, hey, you're fasting, or you shouldn't remind him, among other things as well. So the reason I'm mentioning this is just to give us a thought. And a lot of questions that are out there, when you go back to the foundations, it help you understand how to respond to circumstances. So the topic, one of the foundations is, forgetfulness if a person drinks. Does he continue to fast, or they break in the fast, or they have to make up the day? Or, for example, a person is drinking, they've done out of forgetfulness, what should you do? Should you stop him? Should you advise him? Or should you stay quiet? So these are actually foundational discussions that are talked about traditionally. So I'm just going to say the statement, there isn't ijma' necessarily on the topic that if you forgot and you ate or drink, that means that you don't have to make up the day. So, for example, for Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, one of his opinions is that there is the concept of making up the day in that perspective, among others as well. But a very sound, strong point of view, of course, is that based upon the tradition, that God indeed is the one who fed him and gave him drink, and it's okay. You don't have to make up, you just continue to fast. This is very powerful, and it correlates to a lot of foundational teachings, codes that are taught in the religious canons. So that's one thing. The second thing is the concept, again, about if you see someone drinking water, is it enjoining good, is it forbidding evil, or should you leave him? So that's also a topic of discussion. When we say a topic of discussion, there are a number of opinions that are on there. Now, as we talked about previously, when you're enjoining good and you're forbidding evil, and you should have knowledge of a topic, that also correlates to having knowledge of the circumstance. Okay? So it could be that in your personal opinion, you have a view, but that particular view doesn't necessarily correlate to the circumstance or the person you're talking to. And that's something we talked about, remember, in the topic of Islamic epistemology, usul al-fiqh. So this is a very important thing. And that, as a result, you'll find many interesting muftis in history, jurists, very interesting responses in scenarios that are similar, but the people are different. So the response is different. So Imam al-Shatibi, for example, in his Muwathaqat, he talks about a scenario in which he was talking about a scholar during their time. He had a lot of his students. A person comes, and the person who comes seems he doesn't have a lot of luxury, doesn't have a lot of wealth. He seems more devout. And this person tells him, Shaykh, I'm going to travel to Mecca, make dua for me. So the mufti, he made dua for him, he said, Barakallah, they gave each other hugs and respects, and he left. Then a person came to him who had wealth. Okay? So the previous person is going to travel, he doesn't have a lot of things with him for travel. Now the second person comes and he has a lot of wealth, he has a lot of zad, it's called zad, material for travel. Mm-hmm. It's all there, it's all available. And he comes to the shaykh and he talks to him, what do you think, should I travel or not? So the shaykh talks to him, he talks about his circumstances, and you find that the shaykh responds to the first person, just smiles and hugs and says, good luck. And this person, he says, probably better that you go back and finish up some of your business transactions and these things, then consider traveling out to Mecca. So the students around him were kind of shocked at that response. They said, why? And he gave some of his reasonings. One of those reasons, the first person, as you can see, was very devoted, and he was certain. It was in a very certain circumstance. And he had the patience to handle circumstances. Right. Some people, they lived a certain lifestyle, so if you take them and you place them into Mauritania, in the schools of Mauritania, it's going to be very difficult. It's a very difficult circumstance.
Yes.
Whereas the other person, we go back to the narrative, and when he was talking to him and his reasonings why he should finish his transactions first, among other things, is because he noticed he didn't have that same strength, that same inner strength to be able to handle. Also, his mind was bewildered by the circumstances he had. among other things as well. So it's very important a person is aware of this. It's very important that a person is aware of this, and it's known in communication, science of communication, knowing your audience. Knowing your audience and just, how to speak to them and the topics that they can relate to. In fiqh, in usul al-fiqh, and in da'wah, joining good, forbidding evil, it's very important. It's extremely important to know your audience. And also to choose things that that brings about more good. Brings about more good. So this is something very important to take into consideration. It opens up a lot of topics, a lot of things. We talked about the mawlid a little bit. So for some people, just their lifestyle, when it comes to the mawlid, for them, they start to read about the biography of Prophet ﷺ. Or they start to study a hadith of Prophet ﷺ. And throughout the year, they never did that, among other things. So, be wise who you're talking to, see their circumstances. Let them be, inshallah. Allahu Akbar.
So I had a question with regards to student debt and interest. So there's a lot of people who nowadays they say, so when I was younger, it was any type of interest, student debt, anything is strictly haram. You can't do it, don't do it. If you're doing it, you're a big sin. فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ, all the whole. And nowadays the opinion seems to have been considerably more lenient. And the data they say is that it's necessary. Education is a requirement for life now, as opposed to back then. If you could shed more light on it, because the opinions I've been reading they're not very deep.
Yeah.
So I don't know very much about the topic.
Yeah. So the concept of something being necessary has been a concept in which a number of questions, the responses to questions have evolved. So on this topic, for example, buying a house. People a lot of times don't have the means here, especially in the localities they live in the West, and they have children among other things, certain circumstances. So for them, some Jews hold the view it's necessary, so it's okay to take a loan in which there is a type of interest, for example. Now we go back to education. Of course, going through education, it is not uncommon to find a person having a debt after completion, especially graduate programs, and especially the PhD program. And unfortunately, a lot of people that go into a PhD program after completing it, they don't realize that basically, in the minds of many people, you're in legitimate servitude. You have reached a state which is called progressive servitude. You're going to have to be working for a certain time period to pay off your debt. So considerably, you're in this type of old servitude in the past, when it came to slavery and these things. Indentured servitude is called, indentured servitude. So people don't realize that. So it is a blessing if you're going through grad school and you have a scholarship, someone is paying for you, it's a great blessing to have. But a lot of medical doctors, for example, in the West, that come from a traditional background, they don't want to have any type of, they want to deal with interest, among other things. But to go through the medical program, a lot of times you're placed into circumstances in which you get into debt and there is interest involved and there's all types of things that come about. It's important to remember again that because of the topic of necessity, you have that evolution to responses to questions. So I know that there are a lot of righteous people in the West that, for example, they went through medical school. And there's undoubt that they did deal with interest. And they have no other option to go through medical school unless they went through interest, a program in which there's interest involved. Their intention is not the interest, right? Their intention is something else, but it is because this is the outlet that they have. So as a side point for those that are listening, the idea of concept of loans free of interest is a very pious thing traditionally. Prophetic traditions, the concept of a rich person giving a loan to a person without interest was considered a very pious thing, an extremely pious thing. So those that Allah has blessed, take that into consideration. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the judge. Now in fiqh, if you go into greater depth, the idea of dealing with interest in a locality in which interest is okay, for example, you're living in a society and they don't, let's say a non-Muslim society, and they agree to things are permissible, okay, and one of those things, for example, is interest. And the contracts, they agree with it. For example, you're dealing with a non-Muslim, for example, and they agree with the permissibility of interest. And among other things, a product that isn't necessarily considered halal for you, alcohol or these type of things, There's a school of thought, for example, for Imam Abu Hanifa, that it's okay to deal with it. It's permissible to do so. So that is why, I don't know if you come across this, you find some individuals, they have gas stations and they're selling in the gas station, they have a portion of it in which there's alcohol, they're selling it. Here I'm not talking about percentiles. I'm not talking about that, okay, 95% of the whole thing is halal, then there's 1% that's considered alcohol that is involved. That's a different subject, and that's a different question in fiqh. For example, if you go to, is it okay to work at Winco Foods? They also sell alcohol on these things. But the idea is that 98% of it is halal, for example.
Yeah.
So you see that percentile is considered among many jurists in a ruling that it is something that is forgiven. Just like a tahara. Sometimes there's things that remain tahara. For the jurist, it's okay. It's not. You did what you can, and the other small things is unattainable. So for Imam Abu Hanif, for example, in a strong opinion in his view, in his school, it's okay, for example, for a person to do so. So as a result, you find some individuals that own gas stations, and in that gas station they sell alcohol. Or they own a restaurant, and in that restaurant they may sell alcohol. And they base it upon this old school of thought. And again, in the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, that is out there. The reason I'm saying this is because it's important, again, that people, they don't haste, especially when you look to the other. And this is one of the issues people face. So the idea of Muslim owners in the West, for example, that have products that aren't considered halal for them, but they're selling it, a lot of it has to do, let's say, some of them in which, in their view, they have done so out of a permissibility. Again, it goes back to this school of thought that we've just talked about here. So as a result, you find some people, when they go to these places or they see the owner, they have tremendous degradation towards him. I don't think it's a good idea, because in his view, some of them that have researched it, they're doing it out of a sense of permissibility. So it goes back to Amr bil Ma'ruf nahy anil munkar, depending on the circumstance. Now, the scenario is going to be different if you go to Egypt, or if you go to, for example, Saudi Arabia, of course, and among other places. So of course the fatwa will change among many jurists in those circumstances. So we go back to student loans, especially. Again, it's sometimes you can't go through school unless you have to. For many of the students that are out there, you can't get a master's degree, especially, and or a PhD, unless you have a major loan. And in that loan, you're going to fall into interest at times. And at times, what's going to happen? There's going to be some stress. So you find a lot of people that have went through grad school, they have indentured servitude for so it seems, for some time period, until they can pay it all off. إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ اللَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. But again, you never know that something could not necessarily seem very good, but a lot of good comes out of it. So in Surah Al-Nahl, we have the concept of milk, right? And it's described, يَخْرُجُ مِن بَيْنِ فَرْثٍ. It comes out of a circumstance where there's blood and there's a lot of different type of liquids in the animal, but something very pure comes out of it. Also the concept of tawbah and sin, it's by the mashiyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes people, they slip. And here we're not talking about ijtihad. I'm talking about actually slipping into sin. Not something that is mas'ala, it's in the gray area. And they do so, but they don't realize that that thing could bring about so much good for them. Because they may have trying to better themselves in a fashion they would have never done so beforehand. Or turn to God in a fashion which they would have never done so beforehand. Among other things as well. And actually this statement, believe it or not, is a statement of Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah as well. And he says, even if it's kufr, even if it's kufr, even if it's from the major sayyi'at, people don't realize that it's by the mashiyah of God's will that you may fall into these things, but you can really turn it into something very good. You can turn it to something very good. It's up to you. So you can learn from that experience. So as a result, that ruju' is considered that inabata, that ruju' to God, that returning back to God, pious return back to God, could be something far greater than you would have ever done beforehand. So it's a very beautiful opportunity. That's why يُبَدِّلُ اللَّهُ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ حَسَنَاتٍ. God will change those sins into good hasanat. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. Allahu A'lam. That's a good question, and it's a question a lot of people are tangling with. That, and for houses, to buy a house, among others as well. Do the best you can. Just do the best you can in life. Be sincere to God.
So another question, I have a brother who's he's dealing with getting married, and so the father has put in a term in the marriage contract where he cannot tell the wife to work or not to work. And the brother said, I have no intention of doing so, but he asked me the question. He said,
one more time.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Question.
So the brother's getting married. He's
Okay.
trying to get married, and the father requested that the daughter put in the contract that the husband has no right to tell the wife to work or not to work. And the husband said, I have no intention to do so. It's not really the way I operate. But he came to me and he said, I don't want to put something that will make my marriage contract invalid in my contract, because if it's invalid, then it becomes problematic.
Yeah.
And so he said, do you know the answer? And I said, I don't.
Yeah. Okay, so the concept, the idea, as you can see, the father is very caring. He's worried about his daughter. And I'm assuming that she's educated.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming she's actually fairly educated and a very strong, self-centralized, strong-willed individual, one might assume. Fathers do that, especially nowadays, is because circumstances now. And unfortunately, because of the idea of men who aren't really taking the burden and responsibility of caring for their family like they should, and or also maybe they don't have the capability to do so. So there are pious men out there that are married to educated women. And if it wasn't for the work of the woman, the children wouldn't have sustenance, or they wouldn't be living in the circumstance that they are living in, for example. So as you can see, things are changing, circumstances are changing, and not everybody is living in a monolithic abode. Not everything is the same. Everyone's circumstances are different. When it comes to marriage contracts, there are certain point of views of what's okay to mention and what's not okay when you go to the points of view of the jurists. But one opinion I think is an opinion to take into consideration is that basically in the marriage contract, the stipulation could be anything. That's a point of view among the jurists. Because this stipulation is the voice of the woman, of the female in her marriage, for example. So as a result, you find that in that stipulation, there has been individuals that have stipulated things. They've stipulated things. And one of those things is because in historical circumstances, there were incidences in which a man, for example, did have more than one wife. Okay? Coming from an Islamic tradition or coming from other traditions as well. Christian traditions, Jewish traditions, certain Christian traditions, Jewish traditions, etc. So you find that certain sisters in the marriage, they specify it's not okay for the individual to have another wife, for example. Is that okay to say or not? So for Taqiyuddin Ahmed Taymiyyah, he says it's okay for her to say that. And if the husband agrees, he has to abide by that. It's impermissible for him not to. So the concept of the marriage contract and the stipulations that happen in it, the permissibility, that voice of the sister, there are point of views, but again, one powerful point of view is basically she can stipulate anything. And if the person agrees, they have to abide by that. There's no other choice. Now this is in a traditional perspective, and you have to understand nowadays we're living in a new system. We're living in a system here in the West, for example, that is going to be different than many people's systems wherever they come from, and or if they look to old books in the 700s and stuff. So as a result, for example, it's not okay in the West to have a second wife, and or in other areas as well. So it's not okay for someone to do so. When you come to an area in which they have certain laws, generally speaking, among the jurists, you should abide by those laws. Especially if it's something that is not of the categories of the obligations. So as a result, it's very important for people to take that into consideration. I'm not going to say yes or no, and I'm not a person of that stature, but there's just a background for things to take into consideration. Fathers, I think it's important. Fathers care about their daughters. And young men at times, they don't realize the care they have for this woman, and they assume that the woman is some type of product because they have certain desires they want to quench. So because of that, unfortunately, at times, they kind of degrade the stature of the spouse. I'm talking about the new age brothers nowadays. And for the sisters, at times, they get confused because the person has grown a beard and he looks very pious, and then they deal with this person that's completely contrary to what they presumed. So I think as a father, you should be aware. And that's why in the topic of fiqh, the concept of the wali was considered among many jurists, is because the wali is a person who has intermingled with these individuals. So he can help her decision in taking into consideration the hand of this man. So in that statement, an individual shouldn't marry her, a female shouldn't marry herself except through a wali. The idea behind it was that preservation for her. One of the main ideas behind it is because this individual has intermingled with the same gender and they have experienced these things and they can tell an impostor, hopefully, from a sincere individual, among other things. So, though in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa there's some speculations about the concept of that narration, also the application of it, but that idea I think is a legitimate idea. If a person has a father and or a guardian who's very caring for them, I think the sisters should take into consideration their point of views when it comes to marrying this person or not. So we go back to that question, you can see, I think it's a beautiful trait to have as a father. And I don't think he's doing that except for care out of her. Yeah. And because of what the world could bring about. There are very confusing things that can come about, and unfortunately no one wants to see their daughter in a very difficult circumstance. Allahu A'lam. You find the topic of the muqaddam and mu'akhar, you find it in Egypt, for example. That's also out of preservation for the daughter. Is it okay or not okay is a different topic, but out of preservation. Yeah, it's preservation. How are you? Good to see you. How are you doing? Doing well? See, what was your name? Anik, nice to meet you. Yosof. Any other topics, questions? So there's a question here. I'd like to ask, what is the method to combine Asr and Maghrib prayers if we haven't been able to pray Asr on time? So whenever a person remembers, for example, that they may have passed a prayer, whenever they remember that, they try to perform that prayer, and inshallah, move on from there. So the question of order is a question of fiqh, depending on the time and circumstance of the person, but generally speaking, just whenever a person remembers, try to pray that prayer when they can, and or if they were unable to pray for some legitimate reason, when they remember, try to pray that prayer and then move on to the next prayer from there. So Asr and then Maghrib. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you.
This brings up a good question I have. So I know some brothers and sisters who work, and they worked with me.
And before we move on to that, just to clarify for our knowledge, there's a strong opinion out there that a person can combine prayers. Okay, I'm not talking about in travel, I'm talking about in your residence, based upon narration by Abdullah ibn Abbas, Sahih Muslim, and Sunan al-Tirmidhi, among others, in which he says that Prophet ﷺ combined prayers, Dhuhr and Asr, in the time period, and Maghrib and Isha. And it wasn't out of travel, and it wasn't out of weather or anything of that nature. Abdullah ibn Abbas' explanation that's attributed to him, it was out to show that there is an ease, right, an ease in the topic when a person needs it, when they need it. So for those that are really holding fast to the 5 prayers, I know that at times as students, some circumstance comes about. Sometimes you pray Dhuhr and Asr before you go into the examination could be something helpful. And or if you're unable to, pray Dhuhr and Asr at the Asr time. And or Maghrib, same thing, Maghrib and Isha.
I answered that question.
Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, the question was because they work all day, and sometimes the work day they have 6 hours, 8 hours where they continuously cannot take a break. They're in meetings all 8 hours, and their bosses are there. It's a matter of losing their job or not.
Yeah.
So they come to the end of the day and they're like, I have to pray 5 prayers right now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the question is they're doing the best they can.
They do the best they can. So what's interesting is actually in the books of fiqh, jurisprudence, they talk about a scenario, among others, is a medical doctor. And hopefully who's becoming a medical doctor, they can experience it as well. In which they're in the surgical room, and they're performing it, and times of prayers are coming. Maybe it's a long surgery. And the person that you're dealing with in front of you, his life is in your hands, and or the surgery is in your hand, among other things. So the concept of combinations of prayers, the concept of praying when you can, comes into play. So do the best you can. It's very important. Do the best you can as people. And be optimistic of God. Be optimistic of Him. And those that say God will never forgive you, or to think that God will never forgive me, is wrong. And actually it's forbidden in Islam to say that. To say that God won't forgive that person, and or He will not forgive me. And this statement, believe it or not, Taqiyuddin Ahmed Taymiyyah, he says that. He says it's not okay for anyone to think that, and it's not okay for anyone to say that. And people that are speaking on behalf of religion, it's not okay for them to teach people that. That's Ibn Taymiyyah's teaching that. Right? Again, to say that God won't forgive me because I've done so much bad, and or to say God will not forgive that person. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, for him, he heard about Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi. Hajjaj was a person who caused many troubles, right? But he made a statement before passing away. He says that, oh God, forgive me, for verily people are saying you will not do so. That was one of his last statements. It's a very powerful one. He was sincere, and he's moving on. He said, God, forgive me. People are saying you're not going to do so. Please forgive me. Prove them wrong, basically. So Umar Abdul Aziz is questioned about that scenario, and he says it's possible, Even though he doesn't like what had done, Hasan al-Basri as well, they don't like what he has done, but it's possible. Because it's not okay to say God won't forgive this person, and it's not okay to think God will never forgive me for what I have done, my atrocities that I have committed. So that's a very important thing to take into consideration. One of the things Islam teaches is to be optimistic, right, and not to be pessimistic, and to have a good thought about God, to think good thoughts about God, and not to think negative thoughts about Him. It doesn't mean that the rights of people, it's okay to transgress against people. Let's say God will forgive me, and it's okay I can transgress against people. That isn't the case. If you have a debt, hopefully you pay it off, right? But the intrinsic idea is not okay. So it's not okay to think, again, God will not forgive me, will not show mercy to me, because whatever I have done, and or to think, I've done so much, who cares? I'm just going to keep on doing more. That's not okay. And or to say God will not forgive that person, he and or she, and will not show mercy to that person, he and or she, and or to teach that to people. It's not okay. And imagine the person, as we discussed earlier, who's considered quite extreme in the minds of many people, Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah, he says that same thing. It's not okay for anyone to think that. It's called a taqannut. Those who've transgressed against themselves, don't despair from the mercy of God. Inna Allah yaghfiru dhunuba jami'a. God forgives all sins. Innahu al-ghafurur rahim. Verily He's the one who forgives, He's the merciful. It looks like your meeting is here. Huh? Yeah. We'll finish up. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.